I feel that the Negro here in Lafayette County in Mississippi has freedom, all the freedom he wants. He's not tied by any laws, man-made laws, or made by Congress or any other lawmaking body. He has all the freedom that he wants. The Negro is not deprived of any freedom here in Mississippi.
Jim Crow, it was called. Beginning in 1870, signs went up all over the South separating the races and taking away the Negroes' newly won rights. Negroes and whites were separated on trains and buses. Negroes were barred from white hotels, restaurants, barbershops, and theaters.
I've also heard a number of times that the colored and the white were not equal under the law. That's true. The colored gets the break and the white man doesn't.
So after my video where I talked about the unsung heroes of the Montgomery bus boycott, I decided I wanted to make a video investigating Jim Crow, specifically Jim Crow society, the laws, Jim Crow etiquette, and how it impacted the everyday lives of Black citizens living during this time in the United States. Because I think it's important to have a really good grasp on the climate at that time, and also what these civil rights activists were really up against. As somebody who has an educational background in history, I felt like I had a pretty decent overall understanding of Jim Crow, but maybe not so much a full understanding of its intricacies and how it really impacted the everyday lives of people living in the United States, no matter the color of their skin, but especially Black people and just people of color in general. Because Jim Crow was more than just a law that was aimed at the disenfranchisement of Black people and segregation. It was a way of life for these people, and it was completely woven into the fabric of the way people lived at this time, particularly in the South. So I want to talk about it in this video. I want to talk about Jim Crow laws, etiquette, society, just the culture as a whole. So if you're not familiar with what Jim Crow was, it was a system of racial segregation and discrimination that prevailed in the United States from 1877 to roughly the mid-1960s. Now, it was more prevalent in the South, but it was not exclusive to just that region in the United States. Oftentimes when people think about Jim Crow, they think about the laws associated with it that imposed segregation as well as the disenfranchisement of the Black community. But Jim Crow was more than just unjust laws. It was a lifestyle that was so ingrained in society during this time, especially in the South as well as the border states. In addition to laws, it also influenced politics, customs, social etiquette, education, ethics, healthcare, religion. I mean, it was everywhere. So where does the term Jim Crow come from? It honestly sounds like a really silly name, right? Well, its origin is just as dumb as the name itself is. Message! The term Jim Crow originates from a minstrel show from the 1830s, because of course it does. There was this racist POS named Thomas Dartmouth Rice. Honestly, that sounds like the name of a 19th century boy. And this guy performed a minstrel show called Jump Jim Crow, also known as Jumping Jim Crow. It was from this minstrel show that Rice would create the first well-known blackface caricature in history. And he would put on blackface, he would wear worn clothing, and he would get on stage and perform a song and dance that he claimed to be inspired by enslaved Black people.
What the hell is even that?
This was the whole act. And believe it or not, this act was actually widely performed in the northern states, and it became very popular there. It was a hit among the working class white people in New York. But he didn't stop there. This asshole went on tour all over the place. He went as far as England, spreading this racist stereotype of enslaved African Americans. And his act grew in popularity, as well as minstrel shows as a whole, especially when the Civil War came to an end and during the Reconstruction era following emancipation. It was this caricature of enslaved Black people that the Jim Crow system was named after. So in what ways was Jim Crow imposed on American society during its tenure? Let's get specific here. So part of Jim Crow culture included social norms and etiquette that was imposed not only on black citizens, but also white citizens. And these norms or etiquette customs are just, oh my God, you just feel yourself slowly losing brain cells, okay? I mean, outside of the obvious fact that these customs were just horrific all around, obviously, but some of them are so batshit, and the mental gymnastics of it all is so severe that it just gives you a migraine, all for the sake of the disenfranchisement of one group and the superiority complex of another. So the Jim Crow website has a section where they break down some common social etiquette customs that were part of the Jim Crow system. And we're gonna take a look at some of them. And so I created a list based on the customs that really stood out to me personally as batshit. I mean, they all are, but these ones are just on a whole different level. We're taking a trip down crazy town here. A black man could not extend his hand to a white man for a handshake because it insinuated he was socially equal to the white man. Oh, and by the way, shaking a white woman's hand, no, because he could risk being accused of SA. Anything having to do with white women during Jim Crow, you would be risking your life interacting with a white woman, especially as a black man, in any form. Speaking of which, if a black man offered to light a white woman's cigarette, this was seen as a sign of intimacy. Nothing like assisting someone in getting lung cancer as a sign of intimacy. Pretty much most, if not all, interactions between a white woman and a black man was seen as a sign of intimacy. I mean, a black man could literally not interact with a white woman at all and still be lynched. Emmett Till, case in point. And that was a young boy. Black and white people were not supposed to eat together, but in situations where I guess it couldn't be helped, what can you do? White people must be served first, and a partition had to be placed between them. What does that even do?
This looks normal, right?
See when I said the mental gymnastics and the insanity of it all?
The Negro is not a part of my family. As a result, I don't elect to have him sit and eat with me. As a result, I don't elect to have him belong to a club that I may belong to. I don't elect to be...
For Judge Obar, as for most Southern whites, out of the past has come a philosophy he calls the Southern way of life. The Negro and his place is at the heart of it.
This is the way it has been. It's the history of the South. Is because we've been brought up like this. We have been taught like this. And we teach our children like this. And they'll teach their children like that. I think it is a matter that has been history all down through the years and will remain history.
Well, I guess it's just plain born in us, instilled in us. In spite of the fact that you have great respect for some Negro individuals, respect them as people, and not just as a servant. There is some physical revulsion, I think. The skin is dark. And I guess it's just something that we are so familiar with, it's just impossible, really, to overcome it.
You will fade away and classify yourself as obsolete because I will delete.
Not only could you obviously not show any form of interracial intimacy in the public, black folks couldn't even show affection between each other publicly, like kissing, hugging, I don't know, maybe even hand holding, because this was seen as offensive to white people. Like, you that worried about what someone else is doing. And honestly, I'm not even surprised about this one, knowing what I already know about sexuality and black people in relation to racism, but that's a whole video for another time. White people should never be introduced to black people. Only black people should be introduced to white people. White people did not use courtesy titles when referring to or addressing black people. So like Miss, Sir, Ma'am. They were only to be called by their first name.
The Southern way of life for the Negro woman means that she is dressed all the time by her first name, or she's called auntie, or she's called girl by the other race.
But black people were expected to address white people with these titles in addition to their last name only, no first name. So, for example, Mrs. Jackson. I'm sorry, Miss Jackson. I can't even fathom some disrespectful little shit addressing my granny in that manner.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
If a black person rode in a vehicle with a white person, they were relegated to the back seat or the bed of a truck. That one is not surprising at all. And this one, this one is a doozy. White motorists had the right of way at all intersections on the road. Imagine pulling up to a four-way stop. You get there first, but then another car comes up on the opposite side and they got tinted windows. And you can't see what the motorist looks like. You can't tell what their skin color is.
You fucking income fucking poop.
What now, Jim Crow? What do you do? Not saying there were tinted windows back then. I don't know. But just saying, like, what if the sun is beaming down in your face? Like, I imagine there were a lot of car accidents during Jim Crow. And the car insurance must have been pretty high. And finally, we have never display or demonstrate superior knowledge or intelligence in front of a white person. So if you're listening to some dumb shit just give flat out incorrect information, you just gotta nod your head in agreement. This must have went over very well in life or death situations. Let me get over here and give this person mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Meanwhile, they're doing it completely wrong and everybody else in the room is black. And they know you're doing it wrong, but they can't tell this idiot that they're doing it wrong.
Dumbass.
I just can't help but think of these random situations. Like, was there ever an exception to the rule? This is not a complete list of social etiquette, norms, and customs during Jim Crow. I mean, one could write a full dissertation on it. But these are the ones that really stood out to me personally that I wanted to include in this video. Actually, I have one more that I want to share. This one wasn't listed on the Jim Crow Museum website, I don't think. I actually came across this when I was doing research for the bus boycott video. And it's related to one of the civil rights activists that I talked about in the video, Claudette Colvin. She was being interviewed by Time magazine, and during that interview, she was talking about how as a child, she was just really fed up with Jim Crow. And this was the reason behind why she decided not to give up her seat that day on the bus. Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old girl who practiced civil disobedience to protest the segregation of buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And this was all prior to Rosa Parks, like several months before Rosa Parks. She had literally just gotten out of school with her classmates and boarded a bus, and her classmates were told to give up their seats to a white passenger who had just boarded. And in response, Colvin refused to give up her seat. So shortly thereafter, she was arrested. So during this interview, Colvin shares this really heartbreaking story that I think really demonstrates the magnitude of Jim Crow and just how it affected just the way people moved about in their everyday lives and the things they could and couldn't do, specifically Black people. So during the interview, Colvin shared how when her mother would take her shopping for shoes, Black shoppers weren't allowed to try them on at the store. So you came in hoping to God that that shoe or that shirt or that dress fit when you got home, because that was that. This is so heartbreaking. Her mother would have to place her foot on a piece of paper or a paper bag, I think it was, and she would have to draw an outline of her foot on the paper and then use that as a guide in the store to purchase the correct size shoes for her child, because she was not allowed to put her little foot in that shoe in the store and try it on before purchasing. Just imagine how that felt, especially for a child. And also imagine explaining this to your child as a parent. These are conversations that parents had to have all the time with their children during Jim Crow. And honestly, it's not so different from a lot of the conversations that Black parents have to have with their children today about when it comes to driving while Black or interactions with police officers. So when I say that Jim Crow affected affected the lives of Black folks everywhere in every way imaginable, it did. In addition to that long list that I went through, of course, segregation was a major part of Jim Crow. Everything was segregated. Swimming pools, schools, restaurants, hospitals. And speaking of hospitals, I personally have a family member who was impacted by Jim Crow due to a hospital being segregated. So quick story time, and I'll make this brief. It is relevant to the topic at hand. So as a young child, one of my uncles was very sick, and my grandmother and my grandfather took him to the hospital to be treated. My understanding is that my grandparents didn't know what was wrong with my uncle, like what his illness was at the time, but he had a ridiculously high fever, so it was obvious that he was ill. And this was all going on during the middle of a snowstorm, so they had to walk to the hospital in the cold. And this was in Maryland, by the way, so this was a border state. When they got there, after walking miles in a snowstorm, they were turned away by hospital staff because they had entered on the white side of the hospital. It was segregated. They did not care that this baby was in desperate need of medical attention. And this hospital sat on a huge campus. I'm not going to say the name of the hospital. I'm just going to say it was a big hospital in Maryland. So my grandparents had to venture back outside into this snowstorm with my uncle and walk all the way to the other side of this huge campus to locate the Black side of the hospital to get medical emergency treatment. Thankfully, my uncle survived, but he ended up with a devastating lifelong medical condition that affected him until the day he died. There are countless stories like my family's that really demonstrates the profound and detrimental impact that Jim Crow had on the Black community all over the United States. Something as simple as going on a vacation as a Black family was not so simple, and also as an interracial family. If you've ever planned a vacation, then you know how much work goes into that planning. Some people enjoy it. I personally enjoy it. Some people find it very stressful.
I'll tell you something, this is no longer a vacation, it's a quest. It's a quest for fun.
Either way, a lot of work goes into it, right? You got to find the hotels, you got to book the flights or other forms of transportation. You've got to find fun activities for the family to do. And if you got pets, you've got to find pet boarding or hotels that accommodate pets. You know, it's a whole thing. However, traveling during Jim Crow as a Black family, especially in the South and the border states and the Midwest, honestly, let's just say the United States, that required a whole different level of planning. A level of planning that was required because if you did not, you would be risking the lives of you as well as your loved ones. As a Black family, you had to make sure you were visiting places that didn't prohibit you and your family from entering, or better yet, put the welfare of your family at risk. You had to make sure there weren't just white-only hotels and restaurants and other accommodations. And then on top of that, you had to worry about sundown towns. Sundown towns were communities in the U.S. that required Black people and other people of color to leave the town by a certain time, and usually before sunset. And if they didn't, various forms of harassment and acts of violence would ensue. BIPOC people would be harassed, arrested, or sometimes even lynched. And these towns were very common in the northern and midwestern states in the US. And actually, some of them still exist today. I learned that while living in the Midwest myself for a few years. So imagine stopping in a town just to get some gas. You're not even coming to visit this shithole. And you see signs with explicit warnings stating that you and your family better leave this town by sunset, or else. Meanwhile, Bobby Joe with the snaggletooth is standing over there giving you the mean mug. Traveling while Black was such a hazard that there was even a book that came out to assist Black motorists while traveling, and it was called The Green Book, and it was created by a postal worker named Victor Hugo Green. So I really hope the information that I provided in this video helps to paint a vivid picture of what life was like during Jim Crow. The systematic racism embedded in Jim Crow laws in society not only enforced segregation, but also perpetuated inequality and discrimination for decades, and its remnants can still be found in places around the U.S. today. So while Jim Crow laws may have officially been dismantled, the legacy of this era continues to linger in the structures of our society today. But by acknowledging the past and working towards a more inclusive and equitable society, we honor those who came before us who fought to dismantle systemic racism. The end of the Jim Crow era in the United States was a gradual process. It didn't happen overnight. It was a process that unfolded over several years, and it was marked by legal, social, and political changes, including the Civil Rights Movement, groundbreaking Supreme Court decisions, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and desegregation efforts. That's all I gotta say on that. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned something new in this video. I'll catch you in the next one.